Good evening, everybody. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion tonight, Economic Inequality and Populism. We are delighted to have a distinguished panel here, and I'll just briefly introduce them, and then our moderator, Marcia will introduce our three panelists in more detail. So we have Marcia, we have Torsten Meireis, we have Charles Postel, and Michael Minkenberg. We're delighted to have you. Thanks for flying in. This panel, as you know, is part of our 6-part series, The States We're in, a New Age and Transatlantic Relations, in which we investigate what's currently going on in the US and in Germany, but also on a global scale. There are a lot of topics to explore, and of course, we're exploring economic inequality and populism tonight. If you read the New York Times sometime last week, there was a beautiful article that the headline said, "Angry East German Men Fueling the Far Right," and it was a big piece, and it was dealing with the angry East German men and how they make up a huge percentage of the people who are voting and have voted in recent elections, federal and local, for the AfD, for the Alternative for Deutschland. I also found it quite interesting that that article mentioned that only 16% of AfD party members are female, so it is largely a male phenomenon. I don't know if in how far you will investigate the gender issue, because you are looking at it from race and class and religion, but obviously gender is also something to consider in this context. So before I introduce Marcia, let me just thank again our panelists, and especially Marcia, who was really the force bringing all this together. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you for the wonderful continued collaboration and putting together this stellar panel. Thank you to the DAAD for their support of our academically inclined programs. Thanks also to the Transatlantic program of the Federal Republic of Germany that supports these 6 panel discussions with funds from the European Recovery Program of the Federal Ministry of Economy and Energy. We're grateful for their support as well. I'm grateful to my staff, and I'm grateful to you for coming. Thanks also to John and to Laia and Isabel, who are recording and taking photos. And this is the end of my long list of thank yous. And now I will have the pleasure to introduce Marcia. Marcia teaches here at NYU, at Fordham University, and is a regular guest professor at Humboldt University's Theology faculty. Her most recent books are, and I always hate her book titles because they are so hard to pronounce, and I have to practice and write marks about like which syllables to focus on, so I'll try to do my best here. Her most recent books are Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, and The New Evangelicals, Expanding the Vision of the Common Good. Commonwealth and Covenant has been selected by the United Nations Committee on Education for Justice, quote unquote, to be distributed in their materials to educators, academics, policymakers throughout the world. And it was nominated for a Grawemeyer Award in Religion. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists. And now Marcia will take over. Thank you.
Well, first, I want to thank Juliana and the Deutsches Haus, and Sarah and Elena, and everybody at the Deutsches Haus, and all those who funded the Deutsches Haus and this evening's panel. Thanks very much for making yet another collaboration possible. I'm going to begin by introducing our 3 panelists, so then once we get going, we don't interrupt the flow. And I'm going to then offer a very short introduction as a kind of framework or something we can bounce off of. Then each of the panelists, as Juliana said, will make a short presentation, and then we'll talk. Immediately to my left is Torsten Meireis, professor of systematic theology at Humboldt Universität Berlin, with a focus on ethics and hermeneutics. He is also a co-founder of the Berlin Institute for Public Theology. His research interests include political ethics, ethics and sustainability, and economics and ethics. His most recent publications are Religion and Democracy, Studies in Public Theology, which he co-edited with Professor Rolf-Schieder, and Digitalization and the Economy. From 2010 to 2016, he also held the chair for Systematic Theology and Ethics at the Theology Faculty of the University of Bern. To his left is Charles Postel, professor of history at San Francisco State University, with a research focus on social movements and politics in the United States, especially the ideas that have inspired radical protest and reform. His 2007 book, The Populist Vision, is a history of the populist movement of the 1890s, and he is currently working on a history of social mobilizations of farmers, workers, women, and other activists in the post-Civil War era. And to his left is Michael Minkenberg, professor of comparative politics at the European University Viadrina. From 2007 to 2010, he held the Max Weber Chair for German and European Studies here at NYU. He has taught at the universities of Göttingen, Heidelberg, Cornell, and Columbia. His research interests include the radical right in liberal democracies, the relationship between religion and politics in Western societies, and politics and architecture in capital cities. He recently published the book, The Radical Right in Eastern Europe, Democracy Under Siege, ? The short introductory rubric that I will provide for us to bounce off of is, as you can see, an introductory rubric for identifying a group, a movement, or party as populist or neo-nationalist. And I've been developing this with Torsten Meireis. It's a slim rubric. We're going to do just, it's a short set of points. And because after this short list of features that allows us to identify a movement or group as populist, we have to look at the surrounding cultures, specific history, narratives, symbologies, and present conditions to understand why any specific movement is persuasive to the population. So why do we need such a rubric? First, to avoid the assessment that a movement is democracy if I like it, and populism if I don't. Yeah? So that's to avoid demonizing politics that we don't like with a negative label of populist. Theories of populism need account for, one, populism on the left as well as the right, stronger and weaker forms of populism, aspects of populist or neo-nationalist movements that are productive responses to unresponsive governments and economies. My litmus test for any theory of populism and neo-nationalism is Bernie Sanders and William Jennings Bryan, who spoke neither of an exclusionary homogeneous people nor of moral purity, two characteristics of present right-wing populism, neo-nationalism, which then unhelpfully slide into definitions of all populism and neo-nationalism. So here's the beginning of our rubric. One, people have an interest in solving their problems, not fatalistic, but optimistic. This is an optimistic belief in believing that problems can be solved by achievable change. The problems most often of interest are economic and way of life duress. Economic duress does not necessarily entail poverty, un- or underemployment, but it can also include the sense that opportunity is unfairly distributed and that familiar economic paths for self-betterment are disappearing. Way of life duress refers to a sense of threat to the way things should go, to knowing what's fair, what's due you and others. Both economic and way of life duress may be present and active or anticipated fear of hardship for me and my children. To address economic and way of life duress, people have an interest in who is under unfair duress, what Andre Gingrich calls the emotionalized us. Why and how we have been wronged, by whom or them. These questions, you'll notice, are binary in form. This is not we of just my community or my group, but my group in struggle against them, others, who are unfairly doing us harm. In response to these interests, populism presents solutions. It's persuasive because it presents solutions. It aims at addressing economic and way of life duress by providing who a we is in a struggle against them. Within these solutions, the degree of binarity between we and them suggests strong and weak forms of populism along a continuum. So it's not a black and white or a on and off switch. Degree of binarity depends on a few things. How inclusive we are of a variety of social groups, the degree and permanence of the us-them struggle. Can a group fall in the middle? Could those who are opponents on one issue, say environment, be allies on another, say minimum wage? The possibilities for understanding them as a worthy opposition, part of the legitimate vox populi with whom one's own group negotiates. Greater binarity suggests less inclusion of them in resource and opportunity distribution and in political and civil society processes and negotiations. Sometimes religion is involved in the construction of us and them. When it is, we have seen two general categories, the nationalization of religion or the sacralization of the nation. Nationalization of religion is where religious institutions and believers adopt populist values into their religious views. A common example here in the US is the adoption of hawkish foreign policy by the American religious right. Sacralization of the nation is when the aura of sacredness is granted to the state and certain functions of religious institutions are taken up by the state. We're coming to the end. In order to feel right and be thought effective, populist solutions, remember populism is solutions, must be understandable, while proposals that are new are not precluded from understandability. The most easily grasped are familiar ones. Formations of us and them are solutions to societal ills, are drawn from society's historical, cultural material. These offer the pool of ideas about society, who's in and out, who's we, who's them, and about government, its composition and its responsibilities, from which populist movements draws. Once a picture of society and government emerges, it may be furthered by persons or groups with the resources and motives to do so. In sum, the first 6 points help us identify a movement as populist or neo-nationalist, but understanding how and why a movement is convincing takes us into the surrounding culture's historical, cultural ideas about the nature of government and society. And so now we will turn to our first specific look into the historical cultural material by Torsten Meireis, and you will take over from here. And you have to take over and magically arrange for his PowerPoint.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for listening. I will go into a few categories first and then try to exemplify the problem of Western Europe in the case study of Germany, rather. I will not go into the gender issue, but we can come to this in the discussion because I think there's a connection. In Germany, as in Europe generally, populism, which is ambivalent in itself, becomes particularly nasty as it goes along with the new nationalism that tries to tap into traditions of the sacralization of the nation and the nationalization of religion, terms you just heard. What you're seeing is a faction of the new populist right-wing party AfD, Christians in the AfD, and they claim to have like a hereditary Christianism. It says, wir für ein christliches Abendland, we for a Christian Occident. And you see that Christian motives, religious elements, symbols are used. This is a Pegida demonstration, a demonstration by a group who is anti-Islamic in its ideas, and the cross is painted with the German flag colors, and you have a minister who then speaks in that connection. The guy was kicked out right now. He's not a minister anymore, but well, this is what we have. With Kasmude and Christopher Kaltwasser, I think that populism is a theory with fuzzy edges. So the category of populism, I don't like it that much because it doesn't explain that much. Theory with fuzzy edges, well, populism, to my mind, is a thin-centered ideology, an ideology that needs to connect to other ideologies. It's a style of political communication. Characteristic is that you have a binary of pure people versus corrupt elites. Many moral arguments coming into moralism and policies aiming at a volonté générale. But populism is ambivalent. It's not only bad, but as political theorist Chantal Mouffe argues, it's a central element of democracy. Why? Because binaries are necessary for democratic strife. Passions are not bad in politics because otherwise people become politically apathic. And we can see that with the rising of the so-called populist parties, voter turnout went up in Europe and also in the US, I think, but voter turnout went up. So you could even argue democracy was enlivened. So populism is an ambivalent phenomenon. This is strengthened by empirical studies that say that there are parties, rather on the left side, where populist attitudes may even correspond with pluralistic ones. They don't categorically divide. And of course, populism in Europe and the US are different things. We're talking about different phenomena. And this is why I think that populism is a theory with fuzzy edges, more interesting in Germany or in Western Europe, and I think in Europe as a whole, is the connection to neo-nationalism. By neo-nationalism, I'm in accordance to Gingrich and Maureen Egger, I talk about a new form of nationalism, while nationalism is an attachment, signifies an attachment to nation as, of course, an imagined community, and comes up with the endeavor to form a nation state, often in reaction to some sort of cultural or other oppression. Neo-nationalism takes place in states with already well-defined borders, where you don't have a new emerging state, but rather an existing nation state. And that means that regulations that have already been moved out to international figures like the European Union are then tried to take back into the national context. Often, a neo-nationalism is a reaction to economic and cultural insecurity, I would argue. And I would argue that this populism connected to neo-nationalism may be understood as a problematic strategy to cope with social, economical, and cultural insecurity produced by unintended effects of globalization. I will try to make that point in the German paradigm and the German case. If you look at Germany, globalization was felt through three hermeneutical lenses, through three events. This was the 2002 welfare reform by the Social Democrats, the 2007 financial crisis that came over the ocean with the subprime crisis here in the States, and with the 2015 refugee policy in reaction to the Syria civil war. The 2002 welfare reform was, for German standards, a very strict break with what was valid before. Before, we had a welfare system that was aimed at the preservation of a given standard of living. Because if you became unemployed, for instance, you got 75% of the wages you had before as an unemployment benefit for at least 2 years. And the longer you were in work, you had been in work. So the welfare reform was successful. The welfare reform made a cut and concentrated on poverty relief. But and after a year, you were on poverty measures. So all the standard of living was gone. And this, for many people, they were hurting because they said, well, my achievement in life, all my work that I had put in, if I'm unemployed, I go on the dole, and then after a year, I am on minimum subsidies. So they were hurting. And this welfare reform was accompanied by a public campaign, popular campaign, depicting welfare recipients as lazy, dirty, and drunk. What politically happened was that the Social Democrats who had done this welfare reform, which was economically and politically successful because unemployment rates dropped, and it was really a successful reform, but the Social Democrats went down the drain afterwards because a big faction split off the Social Democrats, and they then strengthened the ranks of the Party of Democratic Socialism, the former Eastern German, the remnant of the Socialist Party, and that split off, and then social democracy went down the drain, and it plummeted from voting from rates like 40% to now 20 or 25%. And the populist Linke, the populist party that came out of this PDS, and it's the merger of the former Social Democrats, the part that split off, and the Eastern Party, they had then campaigns that say welfare reform means decreed poverty, and they were the first populist party that came out of this. The second point was the financial crisis. In the EU, there was a big bailout of banks and a bailout of states who were in dire straits because of their debt, and this was called the saving umbrella. The banks were bailed out with tax money, and there you see the saving umbrella and the symbol figure of the German ordinary citizen, der Deutsche Michel, the German Michael, referring to Mr. Minkenberg. He has to carry that saving umbrella for the big banks, and Merkel says to him, now you go and save the euro. The elite says, well, you do it. On the other hand, you have this idea, well, it says, sorry, we're only there to save the banks, and the citizens are kept out in the rain. The umbrella is only for the banks. The financial crisis led to a greedy North and lazy South narrative, which also in whole of Europe sprang populist parties. In Greece, for instance, you had this cartoon in a paper, Thanasi na Krypsumeta Sontana. Thanos says, let's hide the livestock. Merkel is coming to Greece. So the idea was greedy North. And in the South, in a German paper, you found this, the bill, oh, the fat guy over there will take care of it. The fat guy, of course, and you have Greeks feasting and the German tourist who's supposed to pay the price. And in Germany, then a party started, the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, that you've already seen, and it was started by actually conservative economists who were disgruntled with the euro because they didn't want to have an economic connection to poor countries and rich countries alike, so they wanted out of the EU, they wanted to get rid of the euro, and said, well, the European Union is eating our money, it's wasted, so let's get out. But then a second thing happened. The Syrian war produced a lot of casualties and, of course, a lot of refugees. And then Angela Merkel said, well, we open the borders to let these people in because with our normal asylum laws, they can't get in. So she opened the borders, and then this AfD, there was a rupture in the AfD, and rather anti-xenophobic people took over and pushed the conservative economists out, and they produced placards like this, do away with Germany, we'll make it. That was her slogan about the refugee question, we can do it. Yes, we can, we'll make it, wir schaffen das. And then they say, well, this means doing away with Germany. And the second placard, of course, says Mrs. Merkel, here's the people, and there you have the populism here. And just to have a European comparison, in the Swiss case, it's a bit different. Switzerland is much more secularized than Germany. However, when the Populist Party of Switzerland, the Schweizerische Volkspartei, when they started to have a ban, they campaigned for a ban against minarets. There is 4 minarets in all of Switzerland. And they campaigned for a ban against minarets because the Muslims will invade Switzerland. And they argued with a hereditary Christianism, Christian culture. All Christian churches, all other religious communities were against this, but to no avail. So in a secular country, you can work with cultural religion. In Germany, it's a bit, and this is the last one, it's a bit different because though the right-wingers try to use Christian symbols, but they're not that strong because the religious agents are still stronger. It's not so secularized because the religious leaders, Roman Catholic and Jewish and Protestant alike, are rather internationalists, take a strong internationalist stance, and on the grassroots, the biggest support of refugees came from Christian parishes. So, but you have this split there too. I end on a lighter note. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to direct your attention a bit further east from Germany. Some people would say the East starts in Germany. If you look at the Cold War situation, we can discuss this later, whether that's true or to what extent. And let me point out at the very beginning what I mean by Eastern Europe, so we don't discuss geographic and cultural issues here. For me, it's a pragmatic term that covers all of Soviet-dominated Europe until '89. So it includes Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, the Balkans, and the Baltics. It stops at more or less at the Urals or in Russia. I wouldn't call it Kazakhstan, Eastern Europe, although it was part of the Soviet Union. And basically, it's a shortcut. I have only 10 minutes. Otherwise, I would say it's Central Europe, Baltic Europe, Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, and part of Germany. So in that way, it's a shortcut. And it's not meant in a cultural geographical sense. Let me start with my argument here that I want to present to you. It's a very big argument in terms of the reach. It goes back 150 years. It builds on nation-building processes in Europe in the 19th century and argues that Soviet hegemony has frozen nation building in the region in Eastern Europe. And so after '89, with the end of the Soviet domination, there was space now for things that we have seen already much earlier in Western Europe or in the United States. And so basically there were people interested in finishing the nation building project in Eastern Europe after 1989. And the radical right is a main actor in that process, and it tries to capitalize on the situation of flux, of change, rapid change. But compared to Western Europe, they are organizationally much more loose or fluid, very hard to pin it down in terms of particular groups like the Front National in Western Europe or the Swiss People's Party. And they're ideologically more extreme. That's the other thing, and I want to show this with a few points here. And I use the term radical right rather than populism because not only have I worked on the radical right for the last 25 years, and I still find it very useful, but it is something that, as you can see, it includes populism as an adjective to characterize the nationalism that the radical right propagates. And it has the core idea is the myth of a homogeneous nation under siege, from within and from without. The enemies are everywhere. And it's a romantic approach because it goes back to history. It reconstructs the nation in very historical, but also distortingly historical terms, because the nations that they envision have never existed the way they think about it. And there are several criteria of exclusion that are important here. There can be ethnical, like the Völkisch nationalism. There could be cultural in terms of language and customs, eating, or religiously based. You know, you can only be a good Pole if you're Catholic. There's religious nationalism that feeds into my definition of the radical right. So populism for me is then a particular qualifier of the phenomenon, not an ideology, whether neither thin nor thick. I diverge a bit from Mutter and Kaltwasser and go back to the old Mutter, which is now the new Mutter again, because I know him pretty well and we discuss these things frequently. I use this definition by a British political scientist a lot because I think it captures populism really nicely. It's a reaction, it's always a reaction against the ideas, institutions, and practice of representative politics. Always a sense of crisis, and they also fuel the sense of crisis. So it's not always, the solutions are not always productive. I would disagree. They're always productive. There may be some productive, but they're also fueling crisis. And it's episodic and chameleonic. And chameleonic means you can attach it to everyone. Under the right circumstances, Nancy Pelosi will be a populist, or even Merkel. Merkel was a populist when she rebelled against the CDU establishment, against Schäuble and the others from the older generation. But then now she's not. Now she is the target of the other populists. So in that way, for me, it's an adjective, and it's reactive. That's very important for the point I'm trying to make here. So the radical right then can be distinguished ideologically in different variants, from extreme to not so extreme. I'll make it simple. There are only three here. Extreme meaning they're either completely anti-democratic, they want to get rid of democracy and replace it with a fascist regime or military dictatorship, or they use violence as a political means. They think violence is okay, or both, like the Nazis did. The ethnocentrist right does not question the democratic order as such, but wants to improve democracy by correcting it in a way that, for example, people who shouldn't be citizens shouldn't be citizens. So this is what the ethnocentrism means. You know, it's not a democracy they want, it's an ethnocracy. So they use the word people in the ethnic rather than the old democratic or political way. And then there's the religious fundamentalist right, which cuts across in many parts of oh, sorry, this is too far. So it cuts across in various parts. So what we see here is different kinds of groups. I listed them according to the degree of organization. The first column is parties. And the most interesting message here is there are lots of extreme parties in Eastern Europe that are electorally successful, even in governments. And they have messages that they would get them nowhere in Western Europe, electorally speaking. So this is one big difference, ideological extremism that I already mentioned. The other thing is that the borders between parties and movements are more porous in Eastern Europe. I have given you two examples. In Hungary, the party Jobbik created a movement, Magyar Garda, to do street politics for the party. So they beat up Roma minorities, they intimidated left-wing politicians or people, they safeguarded Hungarian neighborhoods, and so on. This is a bit like the SA in the Nazi context in Weimar Germany. It was an extension of the party into street politics. The other way around happened in Poland, where Radio Maria is a Catholic radio, but it's much more. It's a media empire with very strong nationalist overtones, even anti-Semitic and anti-democratic, clearly anti-liberal. They created a party in the early 2000s called LPR, League for Polish Families, which then got into parliament and became part of a government in Poland. So this is another case of extremism that Magyar Garda uses the uniforms and the symbols of a fascist movement, the arrow cross movement on the upper left. That's the original poster from the 30s, fascist movement, banned by Horthy, who was not a Democrat. They used the exact same flag, and they used the uniforms of the interwar movement today. They were banned in 2010, but then they popped up under different names in Hungary. The other thing is territorial revisionism. Countries that these parties argue, or the movements, that the country has lost territories that need to be recovered. You have to go back to the good old days of Greater Hungary. This is the Jobbik poster. Hungary lost 2/3 of the territory after World War I in the Treaty of Trianon, and it's still a big issue for them, and also to some extent for Fidesz. Or the Romanians, there are several groups that want to have Bessarabia, or what's today Moldova, back into the state territory of Romania. This map is the interwar Romanian map. In Poland, the return of religious nationalism. Roman Dmowski, I don't know if you heard of him, he's an ultra-Catholic, anti-liberal ideologue of the interwar era in Poland. He was pro-Russian, anti-Western, and he suddenly shows up not only as a graffiti on walls in Warsaw, but also he informs a lot of the LPR and party, and now his ideas are very popular in the Peace Party, Law and Justice, which is running Poland right now. So there you go. This is my point, the theoretical point. There is a sociologist, Roger Brubeck, who argued that there is this situation of nation building in flux, which is very explosive in the entire region, because many states have national minorities from a neighbor state. And then they feel repressed in the neighbor state, and they call the other government to help, which creates tensions across borders, something we don't have anymore in Western Europe. That used to be the case in the 19th century and early 20th, but today that is history. But in Eastern Europe, it still goes on. The elites are still busy with nation building. This is also why they have a very ambivalent relationship to the EU, because the EU is seen now as a threat to the project of nation building. First it was Moscow, now it's Brussels. This is survey data that I analyzed in terms of who do you not want as a neighbor. It's a very simple measure of xenophobia. There are many messages. I want to just point out one thing. In Eastern Europe, the level is usually 10% higher than in Western Europe. There is a big difference, a steady difference across time between xenophobia in the East and xenophobia in the West. So there are xenophobes all over, but it's more pronounced in the East. But if you look at voting data, I don't get this. So voting data, it's not stable. They cannot mobilize this reservoir in a steady way. Like in Western Europe, you see the average is pretty stable, around 10% across all countries. In Eastern Europe, it goes up and down a lot. Parties come and go. They name and rename themselves. And so there is also, there's also a lot of, I'm coming to the end, there's also a lot of movement activity in the East. This is a study we did in Frankfurt Oder, that between pre-EU accession in Eastern Europe and today, many countries, movement activities have gone up in these countries. A very recent example is Warsaw. This is the Independence March. Every November 11th, this is the national holiday in Poland, commemorating independence in 1918. So it's the 100th anniversary this year, and every 11th November, far-right groups organize a huge march in Poland, and far-right activists from all over Europe come, mostly Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe. Vlaams Belang, for example, came this year. This year, the government hijacked the march and said, okay, in order to keep it under control, and it's the 100th anniversary, we will organize it. But they let the Nazis march. They were in the second or third row of the march. All the prominent politicians were in the first row. And there was much more police than usual, so it stayed relatively quiet. Is this a good strategy? I don't know. The final point here, the relationship between the parties and the movements, or the radical right and the mainstream parties in Eastern Europe, is very much open. There's a lot of cooperation and complementarity between parties and movements. There's also little counter-mobilization, with few exceptions. The mainstream parties usually cooperate rather than demarcate, so there's no cordon sanitaire like in most Western countries, until recently, that is. And the state is mostly lenient. You know, we have the concept of militant democracy, but it's only used in the Czech Republic and to some extent in Estonia. The other countries just have this laissez-faire attitude, in part because the elites themselves join the nationalistic thinking, although they don't go into those parties. So the situation is pretty much still in flux, and it's problematic, and that's the end of my presentation.
So this information from Europe is extremely interesting, intriguing, and I hope much of the focus of our discussion. I'm going to shift gears to something that I think is Americans are more familiar with, which is U.S. history, and how does that fit in this discussion? I first want to just deal with some definition. The word populism is first used by a political movement in the 1890s in the United States called the People's Party, and its nickname was the Populist Party. This party was a party of farmers and workers in several states, places like Ohio or Idaho. It was mainly a workers' party. It believed in progressive taxation and other measures, trade union rights and other things, farm credits. In that way, it was a parallel movement to the other social democratic and labor reform parties that were forming across the capitalist world at the end of the 19th century. That movement created a powerful tradition in American political life. This movement, this tradition has many names. We might call it the social democratic tradition or a democratic socialist tradition. Bernie Sanders has one of the most famous populists on his wall in his Senate chambers. Eugene Debs was perhaps the most beloved of the labor populists. And this is a big, strong current in American political life, has been since the late 19th century. And for a variety of reasons, it was known as populist, and I think some people still call it populist for good historical reasons. Something very strange happened to this tradition in terms of its memory in the mid-20th century. Social scientists, including the historian Richard Hofstadter, developed this idea, a theory, essentially, that populism was the wellspring of American intolerance, demagogy, anti-Semitism in American political life. It comes from the populist movement. This is an unfounded theory. Many historians have torn this theory to shreds. It still lives with us. Hofstadter's Age of Reform is by far the most influential history book written about the 20th century United States. This is still with us. And I think it's basically because of Hofstadter and his colleagues that we're having this discussion connecting the word populism with these movements that I think Michael is correctly defining as radical right movements. And I think that's part of the problem with definitions we're working here. To me, much of what's happening in Europe corresponds to what's happening in the United States with the Republican Party, and that is a convergence of conservative movements, radical right movements. I think the basic thing that I would define what's happening with what we call Trumpism or that phenomenon on the right, I would define that as white nationalism, which corresponds to other types of ethnocultural nationalism around the world. So that's sort of my definitional framework that works for me. The big question I have about this is, why is it asserting itself now? Why is it such a phenomenon? We have a president of the United States that, clearly a white nationalist and a political party that has been steered by this phenomenon. So what's going on? Why is that true? And it's not just the White House. It's state houses across much of the United States. Fewer now after Tuesday, but that's the reality we live in. So how did that come to pass? And I want to pose one question, which I'm a skeptic about the economic connection. I don't think there are simple economic explanations. Capitalism is a world of insecurity. Capitalism has involved global flows of money and labor. Capitalism is tough on anybody who's ever works in that economy. It's a tough economy. And that hasn't changed over the last however many hundred years you want to measure it. One of the reasons why in American history we have this economic linkage is because there was this very famous riots that took place in San Francisco in the 1870s, 1877, against the Chinese in the face of a severe economic depression and economic crisis of unemployment. And there was these anti-Chinese riots took place that gave rise to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and ever since it's just become sort of shorthand. Hard times, you go attack others. That's actually not true. If you actually look at the history of the United States, there is no such pattern. There's another great economic depression in the 1890s. The same in San Francisco, they're no longer marching against the Chinese, they're marching against Washington to demand federal jobs programs. You can look at the 1930s, there is no such pattern. That's the Great Depression. There's never was the economy so severe, never was insecurity so great. Yet it did not produce movements of this type in the same way. And I think you could go through the history in that way. Equally, there's another important way you could go through the history. This is not the first time that white nationalism has had great political impact on the United States. There are multiple times. I think a good parallel time would be to look at the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan dominates a dozen or more state legislatures, sent 16 senators, 16 Klansmen go to the Senate and serve in the US Senate. And this was boom times. That doesn't mean life was good for workers in these factories, but wages were up for many of them. Unemployment was way down. This is the industrial boom. And that was the age of, okay. Another time when you have very serious white nationalist backlash is during the 1940s, during the War Prosperity. And of course, there are the riots in Detroit and Los Angeles and many other cities. But another thing to think about is the internment of the Japanese. It takes place in the middle of a war boom. 5 minutes? Is that what that is? Okay. Okay. That's the problem. So why now? And one other sort of baseline is I don't think there's any credible evidence that there is a rise or increase or surge in white national sentiment among the general population. I'm not convinced of that at all in terms of historical terms. Yes, you've had some brutal incidents, horrific incidents, and horrific manifestations of white nationalism. But is it more popular than it was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 70 or 100 years ago? I'm not convinced. I'm not sure there's any data that would point to that. What you do have is a political change. We have a new political dynamic in this country. And that, to me, is the most important thing to talk about in terms of weighing what happened. And here's one way to look at it. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was a bipartisan organization. If you were in the Ku Klux Klan in Michigan, which controlled much of the state of Michigan, if you hated the Jews, you were a Republican Klansman. If you hated the blacks, you were probably a Democratic Klansman. 8 Republican Klansmen went to the Senate, 8 Democratic Klansmen went to the Senate. Hatred was bipartisan. That's one simple way to think about it. In 1972, George Wallace ran for president. He won 52% of the primary vote in Michigan, right? In the Democratic Party. In the Democratic Party. George Wallace, of course, is the segregationist. 2 minutes. Okay. What I would like to argue is that what we're really looking at is a realignment of political parties in such a way as that we now have one party which has a monopoly on bigotry, on white nationalism. And in our two-party system, that allows that one party, it gives you a voting bloc that's bigger than the anti-abortion vote, it's bigger than the gun vote, it's bigger than any bloc. It may only be 25% of the population. It may correspond to the same numbers that Michael is putting up, right? But it's a voting bloc that allows one political party to win elections. Can it win steadily? Will it continue to? I don't know, but my guess is we look a lot more like those numbers that we've been seeing in Europe in terms of these politics, but our political system has allowed a shift in the politics to make it look quite different. I think we're closer and not farther. I have much more to say, of course, but that's to launch it. Yeah.
I thought I might jumpstart discussion with a question for each of you, and then we can flourish from there. So one of the things I noticed is trying to get out of the definitional sticky wicket. Yeah, and I think all of us are trying to deal with it. You Michael, by naming it radical right. That's what you're talking about, right? As opposed to Bernie Sanders, right? Who may be a populist, but he's not in the radical right. So what you're talking about is the radical right. And Charles, you were talking about white nationalism. So that's a specific thing. And you also raised, neo-nationalism. Yeah, is close to white nationalism. I understand that. I'll just begin with a comment and a question for Torsten, and then we'll just go down the line. So you mentioned in your presentation Chantal Mouffe's point that binaries are necessary. And so then the question, I think, becomes how much of a binary is productive for politics, and how much of a binary becomes destructive of a democratic landscape and political procedures. Why don't you take it away?
Well, how much binary is necessary? I think that the answer is actually, and I'm an ethicist by trade, so excuse if I get into that field. The answer is not that hard. The answer is, do we make a distinction between the person and its actions, and the person and its opinions? And if I say, well, we have a binary, and in this issue I'm strictly opposed to you, and I will fight you in a certain way politically to the core, of course, but that doesn't mean that we won't, that I despise you as a person. And that means after we have had a very spirited and robust argument, we will then go and have a beer together or another beverage of your choice. So, so the point is how much of that distinction is possible, and if that distinction falls between a person and the respect for the dignity of that person and his or her acts, then we have a problem. And this is what happens, and this is where I would draw the political line, because this is where you start then saying, well, I don't only despise your political opinions, but I begin despising you. And this is a totalization policy. And this is where I would then say, well, there Chantal Mouffe has to take care not to go too much into the Schmittian tradition from where she comes. I don't know if this answers your question, but I think that to achieve this, we got to get back to the studies that Adorno and Horkheimer and so on did under the name of the authoritarian character. And it's the question of how much ambiguity tolerance do you have? How much grace can you accept? Seeing that binaries are productive, but you have then to understand, and this is the second point, not only the distinction between the person and his or her actions, but also that there is always a large field of grays between black and white. And this is, of course, an issue that is determined not only by personality structure, but also by political culture and by education. And in the case of Trumpism and so on, we see a deterioration of political culture. And this, to me, is a big problem, because if it becomes fashionable not to make that distinction anymore, then we have a real problem, because then democratic strife and conflict, which is productive in itself, becomes a very undemocratic policy of destruction. That's the distinction I would make.
Yeah, I really wanted you to elaborate on that, because in the very brief introduction that I gave, I think the concept of your opponent as a worthy opponent, right, a legitimate part of the populace, you negotiate, you go back and forth, you discuss, is a very different kind of binarity than the kind that you were discussing. So I was going to pop a question in the order in which you spoke. So Michael is next, and then you can. So I wondered, you had the wonderful Taggart quote up that, of course, talked about, it talked about populism, and this is where I want to allow you to elaborate and also clarify things as anti-political, empty-hearted, and so on. But I don't think this would characterize Bernie Sanders. So do you think that definition applies only to the radical right? And this is to give you a chance to expatiate.
I've written about exactly that question, and my answer is populism doesn't work as a noun to classify groups of people by their way of thinking. So I don't know whether Bernie Sanders is a populist. I really don't. If he is a populist, you have a lot of populists. You can go back to, you mentioned the history, George McGovern, Henry Wallace, Huey Long, maybe Jesus. Jesus was a populist. He was against anti-establishment, yeah, wanted to save the people. He was the Messiah. So I really am very careful. And I don't want to talk about Bernie Sanders or the Linkspartei in Germany, which I also doubt can be classified as a populist party like a right-wing populist party. There are very big ideological and other differences where they come from. So I would like to reserve it as a characterization of a political style that people use to stage their political struggle in the public sphere. Normally you need an open space for that, so it doesn't work in the Soviet Union, right? Because the moment you open your mouth, you're gone. So you need democracy as a context, but that doesn't mean populists are Democrats. Maybe they're parasites of democracy, whatever. But there is a style. So it's like if you start dichotomizing the world in us, the good people, and you, the bad elites, you're doing this with something else in mind, because you don't want to empower the people. Very few people that we call, or the media call, populist, really want to empower the people. They want power, and they want to put their own thinking into political practice. So that's what I say, it's an adjective. We have to look at what Carl Schmitter called the host ideology, and that is nationalism, that can be conservatism, and so on, or racism, or liberalism even, you know. The FDP in Germany sometimes had some populist politicians. Yeah, Tim Fortuyn. So I'm very careful with that. Can I just say one word about binary? Because this is just a very important point, but allow me to talk about religion. I mean, we had a theologian talking about politics, so I think a political scientist is entitled to talk about religion. I think that the binary view of the world, to me, it looks like a very Christian concept. There's a foe, right? And then there's heaven and hell, and we are in the middle. There's this side and the other side. So the structuring of the cosmos is very binary in that way. And politics borrows from that. And there's no accident. Carl Schmitt used this binary definition of politics, not democracy, but he said politics, the essence of politics is the difference between friend and foe. And foes need to be defeated. You cannot have a worthy foe. You have to crush the foe. And he was a Catholic. And he was a very devout Catholic. So he combined his Catholicism with a political binary optics. And I think for democracy, that's a problem.
I'm going to let the theologian among us just answer that in a minute, because of course you can have the response that Christianity or the world religions actually oppose that very view that you just described, but not to leave Charles Postel out of being on the hot seat. When I was listening to you, I wondered, I'll make a quick comment and then a question. The quick comment is I quite agree with you that economic issues were not always directly and in the same way influential to various populist movements in the United States. But the idea that they weren't economic issues weren't always in play doesn't mean that they aren't ever in play. And sometimes they can be in play, even if in other instances of populism, economic issues are less or not prominently in play. So I wanted to throw that out. And then at the very end, I wanted to ask you, so you've talked about the monopolization of a kind of white nationalism by the Republican Party. And then I wanted to give you the opportunity to elaborate on why is that attractive as a solution to whatever discontent is being felt, right? People are attracted to this, which is why they vote for it, and so the next question is, what makes this attractive in your sort of cultural history perspective?
Well, the first part about economic patterns. Human beings are economic beings. We have economic lives, and that clearly does shape part of what we are. I'm not denying that. I'm just denying that there's no particular pattern of hard times give rise to a certain political response. Inequality doesn't give rise to a political response. A particular pattern of globalization doesn't give rise to a particular political response. That's what I think the historical pattern questions. The question of why is it compelling, I want to just go back to this question of binary. I think it's important to think that people wear many different hats in terms of their political identities. The same people who can vote for George Wallace, these same people thought Jesse Jackson was interesting because of his economic message. These same people think, they vote as trade unionists, they vote as workers, they have many, many different identities for what they vote for. And part of what I'm arguing is that this question of white identity politics, which I think is what we're witnessing, it's always been there, it's always been something that has had its attraction, and now you get to vote for it, which is what's unique about the present. That is what I think is unique. Now, why is white identity politics particularly compelling? There are a lot of things going on in American society that makes it compelling. And we haven't talked about it, but one of the there are many layers, and to make this quick, one of the cutting edges of this is Islamophobia, is a very important part of what's going on in the United States right now, or it has been over the last 10 years. If you look at the consolidation, there's a civil war has been going on inside the Republican Party, and the cutting edge of that civil war is who's weak and who's not against the Muslims. That is the decisive thing. In a mayor's race in Iowa, it'll be the decisive thing. And from that angle, one particular thing we haven't talked about, which I think is important, is the global war on terror, which has been taking place. We have American soldiers all over the world. We have a global war which has weaponized, sorry to use that expression, but it has weaponized Islamophobia at the level of the national security state. And it's become, it allows it to become a question of national politics in ways that's unusual and remarkable. That's just one piece of this story. Yeah.
I think you want to respond.
Well, of course, binaries are an issue in religion, no question, no doubt about that. And the Jewish tradition, but also the Christian tradition, and I think also, but I'm not an expert on that, the Muslim tradition have fought or have conflicted with the binary under the name of gnosis for a long time, or Manichaeism, because exactly this kind of binary was something that was seen as problematic, and there was inside of religion or different religious communities, there was a struggle among this. And when Augustine wrote his book on the two civitates, the civitate Dei, and he argued that you cannot make the distinction clear. Not from the phenomenon. The civitas Dei is not visible in the civitas terrena, and that means you cannot make that binary visible. You cannot make it, you cannot functionalize it to instrumentalize it to make politics, because it was his strategy against the idea, well, the Christian emperor had just been wasted, routed by the Vandals, and now all this Christian stuff is gone. And he says, no, it's hidden in the civitas terrena, so you cannot have the binary. So there is a struggle about binaries, and I don't think that religion brought this binary into the world, but it has to struggle with it too, because such binaries are, and this is for me the Schmittian attraction, they are very easy to handle. And for that reason, it's a very compelling way of thought, because everybody can, this is our everyday experience, that we have people who are with us and people who are not with us, and to have those, to have ambiguity tolerance, and to have this distinction between person and action is a very difficult thing to do, and it's nothing that's very easy to do. So the other thing about we are discussing the reasons for what we are calling neo-nationalism or right-wing radicalism or white nationalism, and I would still and I would totally agree with you that there is no easy economic, vulgar economic Marxist explanation that says, well, if you have hard times, then you get this. As I tried to point out with the German example, the labor market policy, the welfare reform of 2003 was a success. It came at a price, but it was a success. Germany had been booming economically, but people felt disrespected. And this is something you need to take into account, and this is where Eastern Germany comes in. All in all, the east of Germany is not a loser of this whole process, as is Eastern Europe is probably not a loser economically. But people feel that their life achievement of 30 years wasn't taken serious. And I could exemplify that in many stories, and that makes a difference. And then you're much more prone to take possible economic setbacks as an indicator that you have been wronged big time. And this is what I think. And I think for that reason, I would say that at least in Western Europe, neo-nationalism is a reaction to political reactions to globalization that have gone wrong. And by globalization, I mean economical transnationalization, political internationalization, and cultural global communications, which all have a certain hardships going with them. And the management of those has not been very well, has been blundered at a way, and you can exemplify that at the European Union. And what we are witnessing are reactions to that. And this is very complex because in different countries it works differently. In Germany we have now a movement that is Islamophobic on reasons of cultural nativism, you could say. And in the Netherlands, to bring Western Europe a bit more into play, in the Netherlands we have a movement that is Islamophobic for reasons of liberalism, because Muslims are anti-homosexuals. This was Pim Fortuyn's, and this is also Gerd Wilder's argumentation. For that reason, we can't have Muslims here, because Muslims will bring about this kind of intolerance. So in Dutch politics, those parties take over because they make liberal tradition a part of a new nationalism. And this is very different from the German example. And in France, it's even another case. But I'm talking too long. I'm sorry.
I think it's right to go beyond economics. But in the case of East Germany, you can clearly see that the AfD support is much more driven by economic insecurities than in West Germany. For example, there's a disproportionate section of unemployed voting for the AfD, whereas in West Germany, the share is on average. It's the national share. It's one difference. What they both have in common, high overrepresentation of the working class, and that's true for all of Western Europe, not for Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the society has basically been established to the extent that there's no class voting. If you use the Western model and you use that in Eastern European voting behavior, it's very hard to find class voting, because they move in and out. They're very fluid. So in that way, East Germany is an interesting case because it mixes East European experiences and post-Soviet liberalization with the West German political model. And that makes things extremely confusing.
Okay. I think we have a question here and a question.
I wanted to ask about the transatlantic aspect of this. There was an article in The Guardian recently by Bernie Sanders where he talked about the need to create an international progressive front of some sort against against the global emergence. He mentioned Russia and China and other places too, where this kind of nationalist authoritarianism is developing. And of course you have the American ambassador in Germany calling for the right to mobilize, and you have Bannon running all over Europe trying to build an alliance among the European far right. I don't know how successful he is so far, but it seems like he's making some progress. So can you address to what extent there is sort of both on the resistance to this right-wing phenomenon, but also among the right itself, kind of cross-pollination across the Atlantic?
Well, what's really interesting is, when Donald Trump was elected, across Europe, there were these nationalist or radical right or whatever we're going to call them saluted this, as a great victory. This is going to be, and so the identities of these things are important. And I think you mentioned going beyond Europe. I mean, I think we need to look at Israel. We need to look at Turkey. We need to look at India. This is a global pattern, or at least under governments that call themselves democracy. We're looking at global patterns. In terms of Bernie, I mean, Bernie's vision is that a social democratic opposition is what's needed to address the inequities that will give rise to resistance. I think that, and that's part of why I object to the idea, or I think it's problematic to use populism to describe Podemos in Spain, for example. No, this is part of the efforts to build up a social democratic left that's been decimated by centrist policies. And will that solve this problem? I think that's not, no. I think the answer is no. But it will reinvigorate politics in a way that we're talking about political invigoration. If we can have the discussion being about, in the American context, nationalized healthcare or national healthcare system, There we can actually have a productive battle to the death, if that makes sense. But if our battle is about whether Mexicans are rapists or not, we're doomed. That's destruction. And I think that's a distinction that's the value of this revolution that Bernie Sanders is pushing. And I do think to that extent it's very important. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. My name is Ralph Werner, Heidelberg Center for American Studies. Hi. And I would like to answer or to ask Charles Postel. You pointed out to something that I wasn't aware of, that you say that today it is only one party that owns basically the white racist movement, and it was not always like this. And I found this very interesting, but at the same time I'm not sure that this points out to the fact that economic factors don't matter, because there are basically two ways of reacting to economic distress since the 1880s. It is either racism and nationalism, and we saw the same thing at the end of the last globalization era before 1914, anti-immigration movements and return to protectionist policies around the world, in the North Atlantic specifically. And there is another way of reacting to economic distress, and that is the New Deal, and that is to offer more opportunity and to try to integrate more people. That is not, this is the enemy, but we all have an opportunity. And now you also said capitalism didn't change. I think it changed dramatically. Since the 1970s, income inequality has been rising each and every year in a dramatic way, and there has been wage stagnation, producing such a dramatic status threat in a society that had been used for 250 years to some 2% income increase per year. And I think this is the basis, this status threat is the basis to two reactions, not only the one reaction on the right side, racism and nationalism, but also Bernie Sanders, meaning the Great Society option of offering free education. And of course, I guess everybody in the room knows that in the 20th century there were grave mistakes, like in Germany, answering the economic threats with nationalism and racism. And today we have these options too. So I was very interested in what you said, that racism is now owned only by one party, but is this really a sign of that economic problems don't exist or don't add to the thing? I think it's, you just looked at one side of the two possible answers.
Well, I like your presentation of two possible answers. What I would suggest though is that, and I agree with the economic inequality is a tremendous crisis of economic inequality in the United States. Is what I'm suggesting is that both in terms of prosperity and income compression, and in terms, and in 1972 was the height of income compression. We never had such prosperity in the United States ever. And 52% of Democratic voters in Michigan, that's in union halls, so suburbs, everywhere, voted for George Wallace. So, and if that happened today, it would completely blow my mind, more or less, right? But the point is, that's the height of income compression. So the point I'm trying to make is that, but you could say that working in those auto plants in Michigan was hell on earth, which it was. So that's why I'm saying capitalism doesn't change. I'm saying capitalism is an insecure life. The chance of getting eaten up by one of those machines was always there, right? And you could say that these people live a very hard life, double shifts, 70-hour, 80-hour weeks in these auto plants, who are voting for George Wallace. So you could say, well, that's why. But from that angle, then we're talking about an eternal principle, not a specific one. Okay. In terms of this shift to one party, it's not only that that now that there were remnants of the old white segregationist party in the Democratic Party into the 21st century. With the Obama election, that was pretty much the end of it. I mean, there are fragments here and there, but it's over. And the other side of that is there's been a civil war inside the Republican Party over the last 40 years, and that civil war is over. And part of that civil war was getting rid of the Romney wing, the Rockefeller wing, that had historically been sympathetic to civil rights and other things. That wing is dead. I mean, who knows, anything could come back. But the conservative white nationalist wing has won thoroughly. And so those two dynamics to me are, I think, what we really should be looking at. Why, how did that happen? I'm not saying the background of economic stress and pain isn't there. And I do agree that a movement for economic equality can get us out of the binary of destruction. But I don't think that it's explanatory. That's my, yeah.
So this woman was next.
It's kind of two-pronged, Europe and then United States. I don't think people so much voted for Trump because they loved him. I think that Hillary just was not the candidate of choice. And there were too many issues there, going all the way back to her husband, crime bill, welfare reform, and then the fact that when Obama came in, he promised to bail out, at least to write down the mortgages, and he did not keep his promise. He bailed out the banks. So you had 9 million foreclosures. People lost jobs, they lost homes. Many of these people voted for Trump, or they couldn't get up off the couch like many African Americans and vote for Hillary because they knew it would be another third term of Obama. I did vote for Obama, by the way. But the disappointment, so I do think that, and let me jump to the Eurozone. The United States is able to create their own currency. So when we get into a problem of debt, we're able to get out of it. But we know what's going on now with the Eurozone, and you have countries like Germany, which from the beginning were doing well, and then you have the peripheral countries that are suffering because they are the ones that are supposed to import from Germany. So even though Germany is beginning to feel the pinch, you see France now, Le Pen moving up. I do feel, yes, there are always going to be, historicity is always going to impact the way people vote, I think, and create these reactionary, feelings in people. But economically, it does seem to me that is certainly currently a large factor in, and the fact that Nixon took us off the gold standard, which domestically it's great, but when we want to fight wars, Iraq, Syria, Libya, what Hillary helped do in Honduras, these are all, I could just go on, but if somebody could address that would be.
I'll just make one quick comment. Printing our own currency only goes so far. We have to be very grateful that the Chinese are not calling in our debt, which is one aspect of this issue. I'm being somewhat humorous, but actually we have enormous debts owned by foreign countries, which...
Well, we need a balance of payments.
Right, well, that's right, which we currently, right. Does anybody else want to take that up? You? Yeah.
I think it's an interesting observation you make, and I like to do this also in a transatlantic way when I respond. I think you can say that economics is important to trigger these movements because there is real pain. I just thought that maybe what you saw here with the Tea Party reaction to the bailout of the banks and as kind of a betrayal, is very similar to the AfD's initial reaction to the bailout of Greece. First, it was an economic situation that seemingly went out of control. But then both movements, the Tea Party and the AfD, were hijacked by right-wing currents that took over and inserted the initial economic protest motif with nationalism. You have the anti-Obama birther movement and all the other currents in the Tea Party. You have the Höckes and the Petris and the Gaulands now in the AfD. So what you have is a transformation of an originally much more economic reaction into a nationalistic, and that has more staying power. That's the other thing. Once that transformation happens, it's harder to undo. Even if economic times get better, the other grievances are still out there, right?
I just wanted to comment on this too. I think it has also to do, other the economic question, I think it has a triggering validity, but then the question of culture and the narrative you're spinning about this kicks in, and as it was the same thing as you mentioned with the Wallace voters in Germany. As I said, the welfare reform in a way was a success. It was an economic success, and even during the financial crisis, through smart labor policy, shortage of work by same salaries, state-funded, they got Germany through the crisis without the poor people and the workers suffering too much. But the narrative didn't work. And the narrative was, the narrative was now the lazy people get their dues, and that angered many people. And I think in Eastern Germany and also in Eastern Europe, but you know that better than me. You comment on this, please. We had a narrative now. The socialists, which were autocratic, they're gone, and then the European Union will bring freedom, liberty, prosperity, and it did work in a way, but not as quick as people expected, and not to that extent as people expected. And that discarded the liberals. And then who do you turn to? Socialists don't work anymore because they're gone. The liberals are gone because of the EU, and then you turn to nationalists. So the first thing is, I would say the economic factor is important, but it plays around many corners because it's about the narratives you tell about this. And the second thing I wanted to say is that the transatlantic connection is a point in Germany. The most discussed figure, this is anecdotal evidence, is Trump. You find Trump in every paper all the time, and I think the reason for this is that Germany, after World War II, turned for its national identity to American democracy, to American traditions, and now this cultural influx is getting somehow, it's still, well, to change a quip by Frank Zappa, democracy isn't dead, it just smells funny. And this is what's happening, and this is why the transatlantic connex is a point, because when Germany, for instance, gets back to its own ideas of politics, then you go into the late 19th century, and you don't want that, and that's a problem, I think.
Okay, I think we all agree that nationalism is on the rise, but the decentralization of information has not really been mentioned here. So, for example, before this, there wasn't such thing as the internet and social media. It seems to me that that's a real conduit for this kind of problem. Anyone want to comment about that?
I'll make a brief comment, but then I want...
You're the communication expert,
Oh.
right?
I thought I was the religion and politics expert, but so my short comment is at a recent conference on some these questions of digitalization, social media, and the internet. Torsten Meireis was present. It was organized by a colleague of ours. There got going a kind of wave of blaming the internet or social media for negative features about our present world, until people started getting up and reporting on their field work of where the internet was actually the saving grace of women in Muslim countries, right, et cetera, et cetera. So the conference and the discussion among all the professors and researchers had to open up and acknowledge that the internet can be a conduit for the kinds of unfortunate movements that we're discussing. But it's not a monofocal or unifocal phenomenon. It's not only the dissemination of hatred or white nationalism or the radical right. It disseminates a lot of things, including opposition to those things. And so we really have to be appreciative of all the field work that's being done about the way the internet and social media are being used.
Yeah, just a brief comment. You know, the internet, people can look all they want at the internet, but it doesn't necessarily turn into votes or political power. And one of the things that we're looking at today is how does white nationalism become political power? And a key instrument here is association. And the most important association is the church. There's nothing like the white evangelical churches for the mobilization of the vote for white nationalism. That is the way it works in this country. And so and one of the reasons why I think vote counting is a complicated thing. What does it mean? But one thing to think about, I think that remove the presidential election of 2016, which was such a weird election for all the reasons, I think some of them were mentioned, but it's just a weird election. But you remove that, why were the Republicans so dominant? Why was this messaging so dominant from the Tea Party on? And they had two things going for them. They had a very powerful church organization, and they had a very powerful corporate organization through the Americans for Prosperity. There was nothing like that in effectiveness on the other side. And I think that solutions mean human interaction in building association. Without that, we're really in trouble. And I think that's internet or no internet, you need human interaction, human association.
Maybe that's a good place to wrap it up, and but only wrap it up as long as it takes us to get outside, where we can continue the conversation over some wine. And thank you all for coming and for listening to us. And thanks for Juliana and Deutsches Haus for hosting the event.